Let's talk about distribution of the templates. So obviously we talked about definition of the templates. We talked about what the templates are for. We talked about values of them. We talked about how they're constructed. So how are they distributed? So we have a distribution mechanism within the environment. Everything starts from vManage. That's where things get configured. So imagine the previous step is that we defined those templates. So the templates are already been defined. However many you have defined based on what you're trying to achieve. You used variables, you used a lot of variables, you used few variables. That depends, but you have some templates. Now you need to distribute those, right? We use netconf. So we have actually a netconf engine that is inside our product. It's basically a client server type of thing where configurations are pushed from the vManage into the individual elements. Now, up until now, we only focused when we talked about the elements, we only focused on the routers. This is the WAN edge routers. These are the vEdge appliances, or these are the Cisco ISR, ASR routers, right? It's exactly the same. The model is absolutely the same. These are WAN edge routers, and that's what we talked about before. However, the use of the device configuration templates is not limited to just the routers. It's true that a vast majority of those operational tasks are for routers. However, you also have other elements, such as the controllers and the vManage itself. So these are elements of the solution that also require configurations. Obviously, not as extensive as the routers.
Right. Sure.
But you still need to define basic things, IP addressing, basic routing information, just the default route to get out. So there's basic stuff that needs to be defined, but it has to be defined there, right? You have exactly the same model. You can use feature templates. You can use CLI templates. At the end, it becomes a device template that is attached to a device type vSmart. And that's exactly what we talked about, is that vSmart is a type of the device. Another type of the device is the vManage, which is kind of a little bit peculiar here, but you can see that basically it's a self-configuration of the vManage itself. And what we're talking about here is not the configuration of the GUI of the vManage, where you define the policies and stuff. This is the configuration of the actual virtual machine, the CLI portion of the vManage, to make sure the VM itself is operational, right? So it's none of the GUI. GUI is its own GUI configuration. Right? So you have the device type of the vManage, and you have the device type of the vSmart, and obviously you have the device type of the WAN edge. One device type we do not have is the vBond. So what's the reason we don't have a vBond? Interesting. It could create chicken and an egg problem. Because vBond is the first guy that everybody reaches to. So if the configuration of the vBond was enforced from the vManage, then it becomes pretty interesting, is that in order for me to apply the config, I need to talk to the vManage, but in order for me to talk to the vManage, I need to apply the config. So vBond is not a type of a device that we have in the configuration templates. So vBond needs to be configured individually. Again, the configuration effort on the controllers is absolutely minimum. So I would not overrate the importance of deploying this on the controllers. This is really critical. Edges are extremely critical. Must do. The other things, not that critical. Even though I must say that a template has to be attached onto the vSmart in order for the policies to be activated. So I have to have a template of a type attached to the vSmart. Otherwise, my policy activation is not going to happen. It's basically just going to complain and say, please put this device into what's called the vManage mode. So yes, there's a necessity to define that, but even if I had to do this in a manual way, it's a one-time effort of very short config.
So going back to the vSmart template, you're saying that, just to understand completely and fully, is that the templates have to be attached to the vSmart,
yes,
just to enforce policy.
Absolutely. It's a bit of a kind of a side thing, but when you're operating this environment, if you keep your vSmart as CLI mode, the system will actually complain when you try to activate the policy and say, your vSmarts are not in the vManage mode. Please move them into the vManage mode, which means attach a template to them. What kind of template? Feature, CLI, doesn't matter. Just attach something. vManage doesn't have that. You can keep it as a CLI mode. But personally, I like templates. So I use the opportunity to attach templates when I can.
So there's in the system template, in the feature template, there's a policy as part of, there's a policy portion as well, correct?
That is correct. It's a little bit different. That policy is a localized policy. So it's not centralized policy. It's true that one of those buckets, one of those features inside the feature template is actually called a policy. But that's a localized policy. We mostly speak about centralized policies as kind of a key feature. But yes, when you're talking about how the localized policy gets deployed, and a localized policy is really something that takes effect on the device itself. For example, ACLs, port mirroring functionality.
All your LAN routing, protocol filtering on the LAN side, service line
things
side.
like that, right. Sure. So yes, there's specific things that are like centralized policies. It's true, they're folded within the template. They become one of the features.
Thank you.
Sure. As I said, vManage itself can also be configured. And I personally, as I said, I personally like to use templates as much as possible. So in my personal experience, I cannot do anything about vBond because there's no template for vBond. But I would supply a template for vManage and the vSmarts, even though it's a little bit overrated. Well, kind of have to do for vSmart, but
I'm kind of lazy, and even things like SNMP or when people change passwords, I don't want to go to all my controllers and do that. I do it one time in a template, and it pushes it out. Right?
Exactly. All right. Now, let's see what is the impact of attaching configuration templates, something that has to do with, what kind of changes am I allowed to do on the device once the template is attached? So we talked about early on is that one of the critical elements of having the templates is the really centralized configuration enforcement. Right? I want to make sure my environment is compliant with my configs. So I developed this config, I planned it out, I spent cycles planning this. I want to make sure it's all compliant. I don't want any form of deviation from this config. It could be malicious in its intent. Somebody may get their hands on the device, not disconnected device, but device that is actually connected onto the network. It's a break-in into the office, right? Somebody who knows what they're doing, trying to change device configuration, things like that. So I want to make sure that I prevent those type of things from the policy enforcement type of thing. So let's see what happens. vManage, again, step 0. I have done all the planning and all the steps that are required to make it work. So it's been done. It's been distributed, right? So we talked about distribution. Netconf had distributed from vManage to this individual device. So what happens in this particular case is that the config is locked. That means no local changes are allowed. So what would happen if somebody did get their hands on this device while it's still connected on the network and somehow were able to access that? So what are their whatever way they found themselves on the CLI of the device? They start performing configuration. The system will allow the configuration to be defined. However, the very last step is called commit. So the way our structure works is that you have to commit things before they take effect on the device. When I'm issuing the commit statement, if the device is in the vManage mode and is connected to the vManage, so it has a live connection to the vManage, and that is the DTLS connection. So think about those are the DTLS connections, and you have the netconf running inside the DTLS connection. So this DTLS connection, the DTLS connection is up, and I'm trying to make these changes, and I'm in a vManaged mode, and I do commit, the system is just going to reject it. I'm going to get an error message that says the system is vManaged, and as a vManaged system, I cannot make any local changes into the device. So I can continue configuring whatever I want, but none of the commits will go through. And before I have issued the commit statement successfully, none of those changes will take effect. So I'm doing some stuff, but none of that will actually take effect on the system. So this is good. I've protected my device. Not only am I enforcing centralized configuration, but I'm actually also protecting my device from any unauthorized changes that somebody's trying to do locally, either maliciously or just somebody who just trying to play with it, right? Now the second type is what we call a CLI mode, right? So this was the vManage mode, and this is the CLI mode. What does CLI mode mean? It's pretty intuitive. No config template was attached. Can I operate in such a way? Absolutely. Configuration template attached to the device are not mandatory. It is extremely useful for all the reasons that we mentioned earlier, but it's not a mandatory step. So if I decided that I want to operate this device in a CLI mode, what does it mean? Any configuration change that I do on this device is going to be allowed. It's a device that can be fully configured. When I have access to this device through either SSH, console, management, anything I do, I can issue a commit statement. So I can modify any config I want. Obviously, less secure than the previous model, and I don't get all the advantages of enforcing the centralized config. But I can operate it like that. Few of our customers, very few of our customers, do this. Frankly, I see very little reason to do this, but if that's what you want, you can do this.
Yeah, I think it's comfort level with the, just the way people have been thinking for years, right? Show interface.
Absolutely.
Config T.
Right. Config T, make all the changes, do commit, have the device fully take it. So you can do that. But the idea of operating the environment like that is not compliant with an SD-WAN type of thinking, right? Ideally, you wouldn't want to do that, right? You would want the centralized enforcement. So it's a valid mode of operation. The last one is this. So it's an interesting event that happens, which is basically a variant of what happens in here. We talked about that under normal conditions, you have the configuration template attached, local configs are disallowed, and then this DTLS connection is up and running. So what happens in this case? DTLS is down. DTLS is down. Now, why can that be down? Various reasons. I may have a connectivity issues, my vManage may have gone down, multiple reasons. Somehow, I don't have a connection into the vManage. Config is local. Once I've gone through the process of pushing the config through the netconf, I have the config, so I can continue operating. The question is, what happens to changes? Now, if I were to block the changes, I may be doing myself a disservice, because I may need to troubleshoot this device, and as part of troubleshooting, I may actually need to have some changes applied. So if I were locking the config changes, it makes it impossible to troubleshoot. So what we're doing here, we're giving you sort of configuration changes allowed but conditional. So if you're in this mode, which basically vManage mode, no connection to vManage, which means you had a connection to vManage, but you lost it. Because if you didn't have connection, you would never receive the template to begin with, right? So you had the connection at some point, but now you lost it. When you try to make a configuration change and you execute commit, you're going to get prompted. Are you really sure that you want these changes to take effect? And if you say yes, the system will accept those changes, because the system understands you may be troubleshooting something. So one thing to be mindful about, well, this is good. This can be dangerous.
Right.
So, right, we were talking about before that, Tom, that this actually happened to you.
Right. Comes back up, establishes a control connection, and then it pushes the original config.
Exactly. Basically, the configuration that you have applied locally on the device is rewritten or overwritten by the template. So if you had this connectivity disconnect and you were operating locally trying to fix things that may be something that is local to the device, and you're trying to fix things, you're adding config, you're removing config, you're doing things that are sort of in order to troubleshoot it, right? Once the config once what you've done been successful and you recovered the connection, all of a sudden, in a matter of seconds, you would observe that all your config had been wiped out, and you may lose the device again. Why? Because the original config took place and just wiped out all the changes you've done. So what's important in this case is that if you are troubleshooting something and you lost this connection and you're in this vmanage mode with local changes, make sure before you recover the connection that you actually go and fix the template or do whatever changes you want to keep from local changes, and you want to keep them permanently. Make the templates reflect those local changes. Otherwise, you're going to go into a loop of, I fixed it, it got broken. I fixed it, it got broken. So, an important consideration.
So there's no way of synchronizing what changes were made in the loop?
There is no way for a local config to get sucked into the system and say, oh, I understand that you've done some local changes. Let me adjust the config based on your changes. None of that exists. It's in here. It was defined by the administrator. Same administrator or a different administrator has done something locally. This is still an authority.
So you have to update the template first.
Update the template first. This is always an authority. Local changes are not going to be honored when the connection is resumed.
So David, we talked about the locked mode, and there's inherent risks associated with that one. So what is the one that would be recommended? Which mode would be preferred?
Absolutely no doubt, vmanage mode. There's no doubt that if that's where you're going with your question, absolutely no doubt is that the vmanage mode, which basically means template has been attached, is by no means the preferred mechanism. Whether you operate a small network of 5 sites or whether you operate a gigantic network of 5,000 sites, obviously you're going to see more value out of a large deployment than you're going to see out of the small deployment. But even in the smallest deployments, there is still a merit of centralized config enforcement. And by the way, this security that we talked about may not be very evident and apparent if you're only thinking about enforcing the config. But this security is actually a very important element, is that no matter what the size of your network is, you always want to make sure that you don't have any rogue configuration changes occur on the side from somebody who just happened to have a physical access into the box or somehow did SSH into the box. Obviously, we can protect this with AAA authentication. So there are mechanisms that are in place in order to protect this access, but I'm considering here a case that somebody was crafty enough to get their hands and actually get into the command line interface of the device, and we want to make sure they do no harm to the network.
So the config templates in vmanage, who can create those templates? Anybody access to vmanage, or is it admins, or can that be defined?
Very good question. Yes. So the vmanage itself actually has a structure of permissions. So what could be known as an RBAC, role-based access control. An administrator of the system, there's always an administrator of the system, think about this as like the master of the system, can define the role-based access controls, and it really gets defined into groups, and then a group has a user or a member, right? In the group, you have an option to define read or read-write access level to the individual elements of the GUI. Template is actually one of those things that you can enforce in here. And you can actually be very granular in the fact that you can designate administrators who can define templates or who can view templates but not make changes to them. So you can really be like enforcing this control. Now the RBAC can be based on local user database, or it could be based on radius or TACAX connection, which means the administrative connection into the vmanage gets authenticated with radius or TACAX server, and that means that user repository is not local on the device. It's some sort of an LDAP, Active Directory type of user repository somewhere in the corporate network.
Correct. Makes sense. Thanks.
All right. interesting operational enhancement here. What happens if I made a change that resulted in a loss of connectivity? In the previous case, we had a scenario where the loss of connectivity just happened, right? And that's when I have this mode where I can make local changes, but they'll be overwritten centrally by vManage. But I did not cause this to happen. It just happened to me, right? And I can still recover from it. What happened if I, as an administrator, was the one who caused this to happen? Does the system have a recovery mechanism? And that's what we're talking about, and we call this a configuration rollback, right? So the logic behind that is very simple. You have vManage and a WAN edge device. That is where it's important. The same thing would apply to vSmart as well, and the vManage itself. It's very unlikely you're going to be doing those configuration changes. It's a one-time effort to stand up the controllers. Vast majority of your changes are just focusing on WAN edge, and that's why we're focusing on WAN edge only, right? So the first thing you would do is you actually perform a template push. So you developed a configuration template, a device configuration template, and you perform the push. And you've done something in the template that you have misconfigured. Maybe you just didn't pay attention to this, and it resulted in a loss of a configuration, loss of the communication to the vManage. Now, what could that be? Well, the most simple one, you shut down an interface, right? You forgot to unshut the interfaces, which is the setting. You push the config, and after you push the config, you lost the device. And I think we've all been there in the networking industry, where you press the enter and you lose the device. That is equivalent to that. You define the config, you push the config, you lost the device. What do? In the older ways, you would have to find some sort of an out-of-band connection in order to get into the device to revert the config changes that you've made. Not in this case. We have a fully automated way of configuration rollback, and the system, after waiting by default for 5 minutes, and this is a configurable interval. In fact, when you're pushing the configuration template, the administrator is prompted to say, how long would you like to wait if what you're doing were to end up in a loss of communication? How long would you like to wait for the recovery to happen? So if you want to change it, you can change it. I personally would just leave it alone. 5 minutes is more than enough. But what will happen in 5 minutes is the device will take a self-remediation action and basically just roll back the config.
It's your lifeline.
Exactly. Once the config is rolled back, you're at the point before the template was pushed. Obviously, you had a working environment before, otherwise your config push would not have been successful. So you know, if you take this one step back, you're good. And that's exactly what the system does. It takes this one step back and applies the config before the template was pushed.
So would that be somewhat equivalent to like a reload in 5 similar scenario?
Yes. It's a good example. Without the reload, yes.
And not have to stop the reload.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point, right? It's exactly what you would do. I forgot to mention, but that's another way. Instead of looking for out of band, you can do this reload in a certain amount of time in case something happens, and then don't forget to stop it, right? Otherwise, it will reboot.
So I think an important distinction here is, though, this is a great lifeline if you sever all your control connections.
Right.
But if you've made some problem with your service LAN, or you've created a routing, some kind of routing loop locally.
Yeah.
There's no way out of that.
That's
right?
not going to save your day.
That isn't what this was designed for.
No, it's a good observation. This was designed just for this case of critical failure. Sure. I've done something. It didn't just mess up things. It messed up things to the point that I lost my control connection. Now, it's really difficult to do. It's not that common. There's not many things that we allow you as an administrator to do to actually have this self-inflicted, because this is self-inflicted. We basically gave you the loaded gun. Right?
Yeah.
We told you that you can make this change, and then that change resulted in loss of this. So there aren't many. There's really just a few. You shut down the interface, maybe configured static IP address that you didn't really shut down the interface, but your routing became messed up.
Yeah, you can't get to the controllers.
You can't get to the controllers. You change the next hop of the default route, things like that. So there's just a few things. Most of the things vast majority of things will not result in this condition.
So David, a typical use case would it be if you make a change like you just mentioned, and it asks you, do you want to keep those changes or revert back? Is that what we're talking about here?
No. In this particular case, you're really not going to be prompted because the system doesn't really know that what you're doing is going to result in this condition. So the system is not going to ask you yes or no. The yes or no that you're referring to was in a case where the communication just got lost, not as the result of the config push. So you had a working system, you did not do any config push, but then something happened and that communication between the edge and the vManage got cut. That is when the edge is going to go into this mode where it accepts local changes and prompts you yes or no. This is different. This is self-inflicted. I did this. I, as an administrator, pushed it, resulted in a loss. The system will self-recover. The previous one, it just happened to me. I didn't do anything. I lost connection. I'm just working to recover it.
Sure.
So I have another question. Sorry, maybe I didn't clearly understand. The rollback is done by the edge router.
Absolutely.
Right?
Itself.
Okay, so let's say if the edge router, for some reason, it doesn't have a connection to vManage after the config change, now it rolls back to the previous config.
Absolutely.
How does the vManage now, when it tries to establish a connection, vManage is going to push the config back to the vEdge, no?
That is true. Very good point. While you're waiting, it's a very good point, Kural. Thank you for pointing it out. While you're waiting for this 5 minutes, go here and fix it.
So you have to take that action before vManage pushes it back.
Thank you for pointing it out. Because exactly, if I don't fix it, it's exactly like the case before. Is that I make the local change, it got overwritten. Self-recovered, connection to vManage, pull the config, loss again. So I'm going to be in this endless loop. In fact, if you're observing a device that does that, that's maybe a good indication that this is what's happening, is that you thought that you self-recovered, but guess what? It keeps on happening. So you have device going up and down in exactly the same intervals. It's maybe a good thing to look at that. But you're absolutely right. Fix the problem in a template so you push the good one in.
Or maybe take it out of vManage mode temporarily, just so that you can stop that.
Exactly.
That cycle
or take it out of
once
the
it's
vManage
up,
mode.
right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Good point.